Welcome to the Men After God podcast, where you will be challenged and encouraged as you pursue God, achieve success, and raise a thriving family. Join your host, Dustin, and his guests on a weekly journey to grow as husbands, fathers, and men after God. Here is your host, Dustin Alley.
Hey guys, welcome back to another interview with the Men After God podcast. This friend of mine impacted my life in a great way at a conference in Las Vegas for pastors called the Idea Day Conference. He was the first person I had ever heard ask the question, if your church closed its doors today, would anyone that doesn't attend care or be impacted by it? That question formed my ministry philosophy for years and still does. As we seek to evangelize and reach the lost, it's not just about seeing them saved. The Great Commission doesn't end there. There's so much more to that. But my friend's name is Josh Hershberger. He is an attorney, minister, and speaker out of Indiana, and he does such a phenomenal job at helping Christians get involved into political efforts. And this year especially is a great time to be involved in that. So I can't wait for you to hear from him today, his story, and what he's doing to help get us engaged with the things taking place, yes, locally in his state, but also in our nation. Josh, thanks so much for being with us here today, man. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your family?
Yes, it's great to be on. And by the way, that conference was in Las Vegas, and on the way to Las Vegas for a pastor's conference, you always explain to the person next to you, like, "Hey, I'm on my way to a pastor's conference in Vegas," and they're like, "Oh yeah. Me too." and that quote, not original to me. There's some dispute over was it a Tim Keller quote first, but it's a great question that I think churches should be asking. I grew up as a pastor's kid, and that may explain a lot of the weirdness that you're about to hear. But grew up in church.
Awesome.
And parents went from kind of ministry to ministry, a lot of times not really well supported. But I learned just to trust God, and my parents pointed me to Jesus. I came to Christ at an early age, wrestled with my salvation a bit, was on a missions trip out in South Dakota where I just really wrestled the ground that Jesus Christ is my Savior. I'm a sinner. I needed His salvation. And I got baptized, and in high school just felt a call to this area of citizenship. And at the time, I would not have formed it this way, but since it was a call to spread the gospel, but then also to disciple folks in the area of citizenship. The hope of defending religious liberty was a part of that, of restoring the American Republic. I knew I would not do that alone, but I felt like God had really called me into that space. So that led to studying at Pensacola Christian. I was a pre-law, essentially political science at the time. I studied history, met my wife there, and we prayed two specific things. One, I wanted to be an associate pastor at a church, but then also was looking for a full ride to law school. As you might imagine, law school is not cheap. I mentioned my dad was a pastor, and noted my family had gone to law school. So I knew if I wanted to help churches, I was going to need some assistance. So all of that came together in Lansing, Michigan, of all places, opportunity to be an associate pastor, and also a full ride to a law school called Cooley Law School there in Michigan. And so we studied there, and then God brought us back to Indiana, where I was on staff at a church for about 8 years, kind of came off for a time, went back on. And through this, God had really just burdened my heart as I jumped into work at the church and then also work in public life. There were a couple things that struck me. One was when I came out of law school in 2011, things began to change dramatically. And I felt a little bit like I was sticking my fingers in holes in a dike and running out of available digits, as culture quickly changed. And I would hear a lot of, well, we win in the end, God is in control, but I didn't hear much of a game plan. All right, so how are we going to preserve the right of ministries to move forward and proclaim the gospel? How are we going to seek the good of our neighbors according to the created order? Or are we just going to let this place go? There was that. And then there was also a sense that the way I was doing ministry in my church, which, discipleship is difficult, it's messy, but we do that person by person. And we seek dignity in each person. The Great Commission is to all people. But then when I began doing ministry in the public square, it felt very different. Like, this is not relationally driven. It felt like we were doing that like everyone else, putting people's faces on buses. And elections matter, litigation matters, But last time I checked, we're called to pray for those that are in authority. And when Paul wrote that, Nero was on the Roman throne, and he killed Christians, his opponents, and his own mother. It's like, who does that?
God. Yeah, he didn't just send out mean tweets or anything like that.
Right.
He was actually pretty intense.
Yeah, and Paul says, pray for that guy. And if you look at 1 Timothy 2, the way, at least my perception of that verse, how it works, is it says, first pray for all that are in authority, so that we may have a quiet and peaceable life, in a sense, so that the church can fulfill the Great Commission, so that all people, including governing officials, can come to the knowledge of the truth. So I felt a real dissonance in between ministry at the church, ministry in the public square. And we'll talk more about this as we get into the meat of the interview. But about 5 years ago, I joined with an organization. There are about 40 Focus on the Family affiliated policy groups around the country. And I joined the one in Indiana to, in a sense, kind of rethink how we engage the church and government, and primarily building relationships between pastors and governing officials, praying with them, ministering to them as a person, but then also as a leader of the state. And so that has really formed a lot of what I do. We kind of move at the speed of relationship there, and have also litigated a lot of religious liberty cases, defend a number of ministries. And so I try to come at this with a kind of a holistic viewpoint of how do we impact our communities. How can we be good citizens and make a difference in our zip codes? My wife and I met at college, and it was actually, I know this is like men after God, so I may have to actually turn in my man card after I admit this. Okay.
Oh no. Okay,
So
let's hear it. You love this one.
So I was a political science major and then a speech minor. And my view of speech was sermons and declamation and all this stuff. I did not look at the syllabus closely enough, but there was a class, and I'm so if you hear the interview end as soon as I say this, listeners, you'll know what happened, right? But there was a class in the syllabus entitled Oral Interpretation of Poetry. I thought that was optional. And so I end up, I meet this wonderful young woman at another class, and then I walk into oral interpretation of poetry, and there really was, I think, a shredder. As you walked in the door, you just put your man card right in there and just... There's only 8 or 9 of us in there, and there is this beautiful young woman, Carissa, who is now my wife. And I will tell you, it was not my recitation of Edgar Allan Poe that won her heart. I will guarantee you. But that's how we how we met.
Wow.
And we're married, and we've now served in ministry in some capacity together for a number of years. And so I appreciate she is heavily invested in Christian music and theater, our local Christian school, and in our church as a music studio. And so we very different places where God has called us. And that's been an interesting part of our journey of trying to make sure that I'm supporting her calling and interests while also pursuing what God's called me to do. So it's a busy time of life, 12-year-old, 5-year-old, lots of ministry things going on, but we're grateful for it.
That's awesome, man. No, I absolutely love that. Yeah. So you were talking about the pastors, ministry leaders, Christians just getting involved with their civic organizations, and I'm afraid that, especially hey, we're in an election year right now, and oftentimes I'm afraid Christians have believed that my getting involved with politics is to post more on my Facebook feed about how I feel regarding politics and politicians. When in reality, I mean, going at the local level, it's not about yes, policy is important, if you will, to a point, but for us at the local level and making an impact in our zip code, it's really about going to the individual and just showing care and concern. I think you were the one that told me to, part of going and talking with them is again, just going and asking hey, what are you trying to accomplish here? What is your goal for the town? What is your goal for the state? And, how could my church come alongside you and do that, to whatever extent that is possible. Obviously, there are some that with differing views that's not going to be able to take place. But I know whenever I was able to do that and go and say, hey, well, how could our church help the community? And they saw that I wasn't there. I'm not there to convert them. I'm there to love on the community and to help them. It helps them be seen as and be known as real people. and not just the politician. And so I know I had two mayors that I worked with in my time as a pastor here in Bristol, and both of them were receptive to conversations and things of that nature. To the point, the one mayor, the mayor who won the election, we actually got to host his inauguration at our church, and that was a huge deal. And then I got called back when he got reelected to go pray for his next inauguration. And it all started just from some conversations. I found out the guy was running, and I did really, Josh, what I learned from you. I called him up, had coffee with him. And I said, hey, well, here's my thoughts. I'd like to hear yours to see if I can support you as a candidate. But hey, is there anything, how's your family? Can I pray for you and your kids? You know, because they were getting ready to enter politics, and that is its own beast in itself. And so I know your philosophy, your policy, your ideas of interacting with the community leaders that way was very beneficial for us. Now, you're doing it at I believe, local level, but I know you're doing it at a state level. Can you talk a little bit about what it's been like to move at the speed of relationships and interacting with government officials from, I guess, a Christian standpoint or religious standpoint?
Yeah, happy to jump into that. Over the last couple of years, we've held over 450 meetings in between pastors and governing officials in the state of Indiana. And by the way, similar efforts have launched in now 20 states. 20 of the Focus on the Family affiliated policy groups have launched that. Well, I wanted to start on kind of a public theology point. And for Christians, as they go into public life, we may do some of the same things we've always done. But I think if we're motivated properly, motivated biblically, I think it can produce different results. So when I began my work in public life, I thought, well, hold on, like time out. Forget what the news media says, social media says, what even the parties tell me, how grandpa did politics, and just say, what does the Bible say about this area?
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
And we walk pretty quickly in a sermon through kind of three guiding principles. I'll just do this as quickly as I can here, but it's all based on Jesus saying in Matthew 22, when he's asked by the Herodians and the Pharisees, who hated each other but hated Jesus more, do we have to pay taxes to the Romans? And of course, everybody hated the Romans then. I'm sure most people throughout history have not liked taxes. And so they try to trip them up.
Still don't, just to be clear, still don't.
Yes.
Yeah.
But asked him, hey, do we have to pay taxes? He said, whose image is on the coin? And they said, Caesar's. And Jesus' famous response is, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. What he said there was absolutely revolutionary. It was revolutionary then, revolutionary now. So a couple of things that we take from it is the first, that essentially we are Christians. And I think there he's looking at the Roman denarius, which on the back of the coin had the image of Caesar's mother and the statement highest priest. This was not a claim for civic allegiance and loyalty. This was a claim of ultimate allegiance and worship. And so Jesus was saying, look, government isn't God. So our ultimate allegiance is to Christ and to his kingdom, not to a particular candidate, not to a party, but to Christ's kingdom. And for us as American Christians, maybe that's not a big aha moment, because we're like, of course, government's not God. But for most of human history, I would say every clown with a crown also thought that they were God. You had to like bow down to them. And so Jesus is clearly saying, hey, we're Christians. Ultimate allegiance is always to Christ and his kingdom. But then it's kind of as if he kind of flips the coin over and he's looking at the front of the coin, which had the image of Caesar and the inscription, Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of the highest Augustus. Essentially, it's just a claim of civil allegiance and loyalty. And so the next thing I would say is that we are Caesar in the American system. So Jesus was saying, look, government is God's idea. Like, we often forget this. Government was meant for our good, a minister of our good. And then I think every Christian throughout the ages around the world has to say, how do I apply this in my form of government? And this is where I'll go from scripture to just an attempt to apply this faithfully. In the United States, who is Caesar? Like, who has ultimate authority? Is it the president? Is it the Supreme Court? Well, the Constitution says pretty clearly, we the people. And generally, a state constitution will say the same thing. So I think for American Christians, we need to think about that. Our Caesar requires our principled participation. And so I don't know that an American Christian can just say, that's dirty, I don't want to have to deal with it. But rather, I think we are Caesar. We have authority and therefore responsibility. And then the last thing, kind of the way that these if you're thinking of like the side of the coin, like how do church and state interact? Well, and this is like going straight back to scripture, all right, if government's role, according to 1 Peter 2, is to punish evil and promote good, it raises the question, well, whose definition of good is government supposed to promote? Whose definition of evil is government supposed to punish? Well, we're talking about God's institution. We're talking about the Bible. God's, right?
Yep.
And so the church, and so how does government, create its own morality? Of course not. And so which institution is supposed to provide a source of morality or wisdom and guidance? Well, it's the church. It's the pillar and the ground of the truth. Of course, that is at times controversial in our society, but I do think that's exactly how God designed it. And so for the Christian, like when you walk into public life, I just wanted to kind of set that foundation. And by the way, sometimes those three things, though we're Christians first, though we're Caesar, we have authority and responsibility, and then we're the conscience, we're to provide moral wisdom and guidance to government, they will sometimes kind of knock and pound against one another. But the Christian life is often filled with these kinds of tensions. So I think if, with that foundation, what we often do is we'll set up a meeting. And one example of this is we have a large contingent of Burmese that have moved to Indiana. They fled political persecution in their home country of Myanmar. And they've come here. They're naturalized citizens of the United States. And they asked us, hey, can you help us get connected? We want to be good citizens. And I remember them coming through security. Now, if the roles were reversed, like I probably would not have shown up. I mean, this is incredible courage. All right. They left their country at the point of a gun, basically. And as they're walking through security, some of their leaders, speaking English, they're there to translate, but they're like eyeballing me, like, this better go like you said it was going to go. Because last time I interacted with government, it was not good, Yeah. And then I watched as they came in and, they're experiencing a form of government for the first time. That their right to vote literally is like magic. It like opens the door to those in power. Like we get to choose them. We get to come up here and pray with them. And so seeing it through their eyes for the first time was just an incredibly powerful day. But in each meeting, we open scripture. We talk about, men of God, we're supposed to be courageous. I will admit that it was a very scary thing. A friend of mine encouraged me, hey, don't just take papers in there. Don't just read the Bible off your phone. Like take a paper Bible, thump that thing down and open it up and share the word of God with these folks. Because we know that's the one thing that won't return void. Right. And it may be as simple as Romans 13. Do you know that you are not a sleazy politician? Rather, you are a minister of God for our good, appointed by him for this time and place. Do you know that's who you are? Like, well, that makes you sit up a little straighter, right? And it is funny, sometimes public servants, as we don't normally use the phrase politicians, so like public servants, you take that thing out, they're looking at you like you just drew your sword. Like, what are you going to do with that thing?
Yeah. It's time to fight.
Yeah, but we want to bring a word from Scripture. That's the one thing we know is not going to return void. And then we want to ask them, how are you doing? How are you today? And I would tell you, individuals that are even, I would consider ideological opponents when it comes to policy, have at times just broken down in tears. Like, here's what's going on in my marriage. I mean, we're all people. We're all image bearers.
Yeah.
And then ask, how can we partner with you in the community? That's the great questions that you asked the mayor and such a great example of. And so we've been building out, our governor asked us to work on foster care and the drug crisis and mental health. And so we've seen like that continuum of we want to minister to you as a person, but then just like anybody in my church, I want to disciple them and how can they take one step closer to Jesus? How can they better reflect the created order in what they're doing? And so I've gone on for a while, but I'll pause there. But that's where I want to have that foundation of who I am when I walk into this place. And then, I want to lead with the word of God because I know that's not going to return void.
And I think what you're doing there, not just going in with your own foundation, because it's easy, and I'm sure they see it all the time. People enter their offices or enter their space with agendas. They know they have a foundation and they want them to be swayed over to it. And when you come in and do what you did of taking away, first off, letting them know, like, there's no negative perception here. Like, I'm not looking at you as what I've seen your tweets as, or, anything of that nature. I'm looking at you, hey, I want you to know, like, how I see you, and help them see themselves that way. Even if there is a different ideologies, giving them that God-given identity in that role, I believe really helps establish a good level playing field for that next conversation of, hey, how are you today? Because, again, I'm not in politics, but I can only imagine that when they get asked questions like that, it's always like, I'm doing fine. What are you trying to sell me? What do you want me to vote for? Like, what do you want from me? And I mean, yes, they're there to serve, but being able to go in to actually serve them, I think, changes so much. Do you find that Christians that you speak with regarding politics and involvement and things, there's a disconnect between their ideas of being able to do this at a local state level versus the federal level, and their ability to look past the media painted picture and to see who God says that these people are?
Well, the great thing about trying to take a biblical approach, and I suppose everyone probably claims they do, but I do think, we've laid out the case, like 1 Timothy 2, pray for these folks. They're God's ministers for our good. The great thing about this is, I think this would work not just in DC, but literally internationally. God is a global God, right? And so one of the interesting dynamics in American politics is with the Dobbs case that overturned Roe versus Wade and sent the life issue back to the states, there's a lot of energy in kind of this new federalism. And of course, all of our reps in DC represent a state, right? Our congresswomen, senators. Yeah. So we're able to actually minister a good bit to our federal delegation as well. In fact, ran into one of our U.S. senators last week, talking about getting some pastors together to minister to that individual. The hope would be in the movement is we build up our states to be really strong, and then with that we can move to D.C. with this model. There are a lot of great ministries there in D.C., but not necessarily this exact model. So maybe there's somebody in the audience that God's putting it on their heart to do that. We certainly are moving towards that as well. But I think this model of, hey, you're my elected official, and I don't understand how election translates into appointment, but go read Romans 13. I believe that to be true. And that opens the door to, hey, I'm your constituent. How can I pray for you? How can I get to know you? How can we work together in the community? So yes, it's already working with our federal delegations around the country, and hopefully someday soon we'll have kind of a plant there in DC as well.
Oh, that'd be awesome. So it is election year, Josh, and it is time to pick the president. Obviously, two polarizing candidates and the various different views and stuff that's going on there. And you kind of hinted around at it earlier of Christians that are can sometimes neglect their right to vote or can stay away from politics because they don't want to be a part of it. But as the Constitution says, we the people, we are the Caesar, we are the ones with the power and authority there. What's some of the best advice and counsel you give to believers in election years or when it comes to getting involved in politics and utilizing their right to vote?
So there's a great voting guide in Exodus, of all places. And I generally refer to this as Jethro's voting guide. Now, I imagine most of your audience is a little bit younger. Maybe they don't remember the Beverly Hillbillies, but it seems like it's kind of held on. I don't know how. Yeah. And if you're not familiar, it's a great show. A bunch of hillbillies go to California. Like, what
those are my people, Josh. That's where I'm from. I relate well.
Yeah, so it's a great show. So this is not the Jethro of Beverly Hillbillies. This is Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. And he looks at Moses and said, look, you've completely overwhelmed yourself and you need help. So go find some folks. And he gives them 4 qualifications. Essentially that they would be able individuals, they'd be competent, that they would fear God, that they would exhibit financial integrity, and that they would exhibit honesty. And so I think those are where we start. Now, in a pluralistic society, I would dig into that idea of, like, do you fear God? Do you believe that there is some higher power that you're going to be accountable to after you're out of office? Like, what a healthy thing for somebody in power. Yeah. And by the way, what I'm talking about here is different than this. There's a constitutional prohibition on a religious test for office. What I'm talking about here is when individual Christians are trying to apply wisdom to who should represent them. And so absolutely we should apply our biblical principles. So that fearing God, I think, is a huge one that we need to dig into and think about. Also, is this person someone that exhibits honesty? Do they exhibit financial integrity? And these are often not the leading issues. But then the next question that I would encourage folks to think about is not, should I vote for the lesser of two evils? Because the old quip, like, unless Jesus is on the ballot, you're always voting for the lesser of two evils.
Yeah.
But rather, how can I most strategically promote the created order in the place that God's placed me? And what I mean by the created order, I would go back to the fact that we're made in the image of God. And we do a lot of teaching on this. I think the entire church's public witness is built on the fact that we're made in God's image. For example, that we are made in the image of God. So from conception until natural death, we are worthy of the protection of our laws. That same principle also underlies the Matthew 25 principles, that we should care for the poor, the prisoner, and the immigrant. Why? Because we're made in the image of God. And if you go against the created order, you will get splinters, as the saying goes. So, and the thing is, if we're promoting those principles, the fact that we're made in God's image, religious liberty for all people, the biblical sexual ethic, ethnic unity and justice, the Matthew 25 principles, the sanctity of life. If we're promoting those principles, we are not like selfishly legislating our own morality. We're not choosing people out of a selfish sense of, okay, I want to make this place look like me so I'm comfortable. And we're not doing that. Rather, we are promoting God's principles and an institution that he created, and we can be confident that it is good for us and for all people. The other thing that gets thrown around a bit is this statement, well, Christian, aren't you just a Christian nationalist? And a great way to respond to that statement is, well, what do you mean by that? Because everybody's got a definition of what it means to be a Christian nationalist. I do think there is a form of nationalism that is unhealthy and wrong. I would define that like Christian nationalism or nationalism as an unbiblical worship of country. And if you need a definition, look at the German church right before World War II. It was completely co-opted by the Nazi regime, and they're rolling out Nazi banners in churches. Dietrich Bonhoeffer stood against that. You can read that story. It's very compelling. But that's not what we're talking about here today. What we're talking about here today is what I would call Christian citizenship. So nationalism, unbiblical worship of country, Christian citizenship, worship of Christ that compels me to love and serve my neighbor. That is very different. So to pull all of that together for this particular election season, and I'm not going to make an endorsement here, I would just say, think about how can I most strategically promote the created order through my vote. So certainly the sanctity of life is a big issue. I also don't think it's the only issue that Christians should be thinking about. There certainly are a number of issues related to sex and gender, to the transgender movement, that are also big issues at play that Christians should think about. And again, just the question of how can I most strategically engage? You haven't asked this question. I think it's kind of implied, though, is what about third-party voting? I've had Christians ask me that.
Yeah.
And I think if Christians are voting third party, so one of the third party advocates framed it this way: the vote for us is a vote you can feel good about. I was like, well, that's fair enough. Like if you look at their platform. Yeah. But if the argument is, especially if you have more conservative Christians that are looking at the pro-life ethic and the Republican Party backtracking on some of that, I think one argument that I've heard, and by the way, I've been in our Bible studies with churches. I've been in a setting where there's like an ultra mega Republican, there's like self-described closet Democrats, and then a moderate Republican. And I watched as this pastor just did a great job of like, all right, here's what you said. Have you thought about this? And so I think that's actually the best place for these kinds of conversations to happen. But if the idea is, all right, I'm going to withhold my vote from a party so that I'm going to show them. And so next time they'll listen to me. I think that fundamentally misunderstands power and politics, whereas I think the parties will misread that. That's not the message they would get from that. I leave that ultimately up to your listeners' consciences as they wrestle through those things. But I would say, think about biblical principles, apply them, ask how can I best, strategically promote the created order and the flourishing of my city and state.
Man, I love that, and I love how you define you help disarm that idea of Christian nationalism by defining it properly of Christian citizenship. Because I'm a patriot, served my country, very thankful for America and all that it is, and I think sometimes that gets lost, especially when we don't get out into other countries or see just really how great we have it. I was just speaking with a missionary from Holland the other day, and Holland, we don't think about it being a terrible place. It's got beautiful tulips, amazing windmills, and there's Amsterdam and stuff like that. But overall, we don't really hear a lot bad about the country, right? It's not like the Middle East. That's not what we're hearing about. However, one small thing that I found interesting was that that for someone to own a home, a standalone home, was actually quite uncommon. Most people lived in apartment complexes and things of that nature. And he was speaking about from his area. He said it was just very common for them to grow up that way. So for someone to have their own house, have their own yard, it was just not the most common thing that they saw there. And it made me really think, it's just like, for us, like that's almost like the standard everyone's striving for is to get your own place, right? Everyone wants to buy their first house and do that, live the American dream, if you will. And I thought that was an interesting concept that I take for granted. But again, it's just one area that I take for granted compared to so many more. And you were just talking about I'm sorry, I'm forgetting what country they were from. Those one immigrants, and
the Burmese,
the Burmese, what they were running from, and the freedom that we truly do have. I was recently asked a question by a church of what do you think something about the tribulations or the trials or the not persecution. That was too strong of a word, but the issues facing the American church today and how are you going to shepherd your flock through it was the words that were used. And I responded with just like, I'm very careful to answer this question because I'm afraid we as Americans try to take what we're facing today and try to blow it out of proportion, because what Christianity has faced since the beginning underneath Nero and others and some today, that's not where we're at. Now, I'm not going to be foolish to say it could never come here. However, we got to be careful not to say that we're facing something similar to that today. And the only way to prevent that from happening, I believe, is, we can pray, we can be involved with our churches, but we've got to be involved with the government as good citizens. So as we begin to wrap up, talk about the Good Citizen Project, what it is you do, how our listeners can get in touch with you, and maybe if there is I know you said there's like 20 states, but if there's a place they could go to see if there's one of these organizations near them to get involved with.
Yeah, at the Good Citizen Project, we walk through a 4-step plan. And so we've talked about voting, but actually that's not where I start. And we've already gone through kind of 3 of the steps in the sense of you start with understanding who you are, going over, reviewing your role as citizen, understanding that biblically, and then offering prayer for, building relationships with those in office, and then offering solutions, partnering with government. For example, here in the state of Indiana, we're working on church-state partnerships on foster care and mental health, drug addiction. And then that leads, if you do that well, you know who you are in Christ. Your elected officials know who you are and that you care about them. They also know that you care about the city. And then that sets you up to do the hard work of Christian citizenship, which is often the public policy. And don't run over our religious liberty. And that's, to me, is just essentially discipleship. And I've struggled with this before because I want to be a partner, a friend of those in office. But then there's sometimes things that they do that, hey, that's not going to lead to human flourishing. That's going to check this church's witness. And the more I've looked at it as discipleship, like one day, you're helping somebody, hey, you're doing great. The next day, hey, man, you got spiritual egg on your face. I'm sure the Men After God podcast is doing that a good bit. Hey, get your act together. And that's essentially what we're doing. And to your point, I look at all of this as stewardship. Like, we did not create the American experiment. We did not create the fact that our country still has global influence. But property tax exemptions, the free speech exemptions for ministerial employees, for churches, the spirit of generosity among American Christians, the general freedom that we enjoy, those things are worth more than a shrug. And God placed us in this place at this time and place. And I really wrestle if we're just kind of throwing our hands up and saying, well, Jesus, come quickly, this place is done. And I wanted to zero that in a little bit for for your audience for men. I was looking at some stats, and you may know Sean Tice and the Fatherless Ministries. And we talked through some stats, and I've come across these stats. I worked for a short time as a public defender, and was just blown away by seeing these things. So something like 85% of youths in prison grew up in a fatherless home. 71% of pregnant teenage girls come from a fatherless home. This is all from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And so I think for men especially, I think your podcast is probably calling them to leadership. I know I've
absolutely
tuned in here, calling in leadership in the home, and that's a loving, Christ-like, sacrificial leadership. But it's leadership nonetheless, and it's leadership's often doing hard things, and especially in this culture that it either says check out entirely, or if you are involved, you're a deadbeat, you're no good. So it's time for the men to stand up. The church as well. Where are men on Sunday mornings? So in our families and in the church, but there's a third God ordained institution, and that's the state. And the state needs good Christian, God fearing, strong, courageous men that also love like Jesus loved. I tell you, there is a place for men like that to step up. The United States is in a critical moment. I think the Christian church is in a critical moment, and so I think it's time to lead. And God gave me this year the verse, "Be strong and courageous." My name is Josh, so I guess that's appropriate. But that my inclination is actually not to sometimes stand up and say something. I think there's a lot of that, and it's done poorly. And so often my inclination is to come over and say, "Let's figure this out." But sometimes there does need to be a voice that says, "Hey, here's what's good, here's what's true, here's what's beautiful." And I do think that our culture, our government certainly needs that. The public square needs that. So just a plug there for the men in the audience as they're thinking about their role of being a leader in every area of your life. And your zip code needs that.
All right, Josh, and how can our guys find you, get in touch with the organizations that you've mentioned here that they could potentially partner with inside their own state if it's active?
Sure. So one of the first ways would just be goodcitizen.us. We have the Good Citizen podcast, and we actually just released, if you're watching the video, the Good Citizen, which is a study guide for small groups, and it's based on the book, but that's accompanied by 8 videos as well. And that's from pastors telling me, hey, the best place to work this stuff out is going to be in the Sunday school. It's going to be in the small group in the context of relationship. And then if you're looking for some resources specifically for this election, you can navigate, and I'll send Dustin the link here for the show notes. Just choose well 2024, and you can go to your state. And if you're looking for those, nonpartisan, biblically based resources, saying, hey, let's steward our vote, it's just by state. You can click into that, and you will also see on that website some of the states that have launched these efforts. I was speaking in Texas recently at a church, and one of my colleagues lived maybe 15 minutes away from that pastor's church, so we were able to get that pastor plugged in with them. I kind of say this towards the end, and I don't want to be a fearmonger, but I did want to raise the alarm on an issue that is, I think, specifically going to affect men, and getting plugged into some of these state organizations is going to be very important for the reason I'm about to share. For over 2 years, I represented a family here in Indiana, strong Christian folks, and their son came to them in this incredibly difficult situation. But son came to them at 16, declared himself to be a girl because of their beliefs, but also their research, and extensive research in the area. They believed that raising him according to his biological sex was what was best for him. We flourish when we embrace who God created us to be.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, the state came in and treated that as if it were neglect or abuse, and removed him from their care, from their custody, and then barred them from speaking to him about the entire topic of gender. They also placed him in a home specifically chosen because they would use a chosen name or preferred name and pronoun. After about 5 months, the state dismissed all allegations against the parents. Like, we knew from the beginning, we were proven, hey, we're innocent, we haven't done anything wrong. And even after the state dismissed all those allegations, they kept their son out of their home. The state kept their son out of their home. And he was out for over 2 years. He was never placed back, eventually aging out. We appealed that. Here's a copy of the the petition to the U.S. Supreme Court. Unfortunately, the court did not take it. We think primarily because it's so new and novel. But that I thought was at first was just a mistake. Like this was just a one situation. But we have learned since that this is a leading legal effort of opponents of, I would say, a biblical worldview, and that this is now an actual effort. It's being codified into laws that unless you go along with the sexual revolution on this one, you can have your non-affirmation is how it's framed, but you're basically your adherence to biological sex, raising your kid according to the nurture and admonition of the Lord. You can have that framed as abuse, and the entire machinery of the child welfare state brought down on you. So states like California and Washington and Minnesota have already passed laws to this effect, and we think we're going to see others. So if I can kind of drill in, like that's, to me, this is not Christians trying to foist their belief on someone. This is just Christian parents trying to raise their kids. And you think of it as a father, have your own child taken out of your home, away from your ability to guide and lead them. I mean, so this is, I think, one of the leading issues of concern that I have. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate about, hey, we need Christians engaged so that we can, as citizens, stand up and say, hey, that's a line. Here's the church, here's the home, government. You don't get to intrude here. Now, if a parent's abusing a kid, they're on drugs, that's very different. State needs to step in. But these are fit, loving parents. And so I did just a little bit of context. Like these are some of the things that I wrestle with, and one of the reasons I'm just encouraging Christians, and especially the men out there, to get engaged.
Man, that is not even personally. I mean, you said they did the research and things of that nature, and I think that's what it's going to take is for it to come out. Is that there's research that's not just biblically oriented, but just overall for that, because that's a Christian issue. But man, that's just an issue, period, for the state to be able to remove a child over something of that nature. And so thank you, Josh, for bringing that up. I know we got a hard line here that I need to go ahead and sign us off with. Guys, you've heard such great value today from a good friend of mine, and I so hope that you will be involved in this political season and in your state, local governments, federal governments, as best as you can. Ultimately, praying for them, praying for their souls for salvation, praying for God to work in their hearts, and for you to be able to have an impact. Josh, thank you for being with us today. And to everyone else, catch one of our other episodes that we are going to be putting out starting November of 2024 on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. We look forward to engaging you then. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to the Men After God podcast. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, and keep up with the show by following us at facebook.com/menaftergod. You can also reach out to Dustin personally at dustin@seekconsulting.us with any questions or for coaching on being a man after God. Until next time.